Thank you very much. Really appreciate the IG letting me speak again. Um, Coming to one of the topics I feel very passionate about and I don't feel gets enough attention, which is Connection Manager. I have given several talks in the past on Connection Manager that were more of the real nitty gritty on getting going. I will have in the final PDF a link, or you can Google it. A prior talk I gave last year for the IUG, which is kind of the going through all of the different settings. This one's a little more specific on some of the other ways that you can use Connection Manager. So that's kind of where this came out. I am also going to apologize right up front for, as Lester mentioned, this being a live one. I have had COVID for the last week and a half, so my voice is still not entirely back. But when we were going to originally record this, I was completely out of action. So I greatly appreciate them working with my schedule and letting me do this live. As Lester mentioned, this is being recorded. And as usual, keep yourself muted. We'll have the chat available to ask questions. Um, so really the connection manager documentation out there is incomplete, I think is a fair way to put it. You can find out most of the settings through the assorted the HCL and the IBM documentation, but there's not a lot of explanation for how they fit together, what you actually need to configure, and for a lot of people, there's a good deal of trial and error. Hopefully between this and the past talk, you'll be able to get it put together, get going with it. There are a few parts in this talk where I'm going to gloss over some of the settings. Again, reference back if you need details on any of the individual settings. My past talk on this. I really want to get to some of the newer, I shouldn't say newer features, but some of the other features that we don't cover the other talk. Um, so main thing we're going to go into on this one, the real point of it is, what are some ways we can configure it? How can we use it? Um, Real quick background, if you have not worked with it, it's been around since 11.5. They did a big revamp in 11.7, and they've done iterative improvements since then. Um, it's free with the engine. It's actually bundled with the CSDK package. So, and when I say free here, I mean free. You can go, you can have multiple installations. There's not extra licensing involved with it. You can set it up where you want it and how you need it. It's a really nice aspect that IBM put out there. It's entirely standalone, it just acts as the middleman or the manager, I should say, hence the name, um, between your clients and your server. A couple of ways to configure we'll talk about. You can set it up as a central broker. You can set it up as a cluster. You can set it up just as a convenient pass-through to manage legacy pieces. There's a lot of flexibility. So the basic topology when you come to this, and this is around the concept of disaster recovery. So disaster recovery, you've got two servers and then a third extra server sitting out there, and we want users to be able to connect. Right now in your standard system, you have your users, they'll connect directly to the server. Everything is happy until it's not. One of the servers goes down. You need to do maintenance on one of them. Suddenly, your clients are failing. And either they're continuing to fail until that server comes back online, or you're running around having to go reconfigure each client to tell it to, oh, we need to go over to this server now, or this new IP address or port number, or whatever has changed. You're now configuring 3, 5, 10, 100 different clients to the new place. The goal with Connection Manager in this case is a single point you can point the clients to, or a cluster of servers that if you need to fail over, you need to move to a new location, whatever the case may be, all you have to do is change one place for the connection manager and the clients will be none the wiser. You don't need to go in and change all of those. You don't have to worry about anything else. And if you do a failover, the clients will just reconnect and connect to the new server. You don't have to worry about there being an extended outage with that occurring. So number of different ways to configure it. The simple way is we've got a client, we've got a connection manager, and a single instance. Really simple, not a lot that needs to get configured. It's just a straight pass through. Where it gets more complicated is if we're dealing with replication, where we give it rules to tell it, okay, we've got our primary, our secondary, and our RSS server. Under what conditions does it go to which server? So there are some options we have with how we configure it. Same thing if you're using enterprise replication, you can set it up for different rules to go to different servers. Um, and you can set up groups of rules. So well, one of my favorite ones is I've got my primary connections, but then I've got a separate reporting rule. So if I'm coming in from the analytics team, it's taking me to this other server that's not used very much that has more processing power to do all of my end of year pieces. So they're not bogging down our primary. So I'm gonna kind of skim through these, but just real quick. Obviously we're using SQL host. The on cmsm is actually the connection manager primary binary. So you'll see that when you install the client SDK. You have a config file for it, and you can have its own alarm program. Uh, so on config parameters, I'm going to mention the DR auto. You can set this if you're not familiar with it and you're using HDR, you can set it up to handle auto failovers under conditions. They added a new option 3, which means our connection managers will actually handle the failover. Um, so it's a very simple program. There are 3 ways to run it. Um, one is just with -c to tell it where the config file is. That'll start it. If we give it the -k, then the -c, it'll stop it. And the -r and the -c, it'll reload the config file. That's it. Not a lot of other options you have to deal with. Um, Really simple SQL host example. We have our standard instance, this is the instance 1 TCP. This is what we all have been using for years. We add a new SQL host instance and listener for connection manager. So this is going to be a separate listener on a separate port, and that's what connection manager will be running on. Then we have our config file. So we have a little bit of information about the connection manager, and then we tell it the cluster. So the cluster is the server or group of servers we're connecting to. Um, so I'm not going to go through all of the options here. I'm just going to hit some of the big ones. The one that we're going to be covering later on is actually the name. So this needs to be a unique name. So you can run multiple connection managers, all of them working together. So a client could connect to any of those servers in the connection manager cluster. They'll get redirected the same way. The name field is the one part that needs to be unique. So each connection manager needs to have its own name. Um, we'll bring that up in a little bit, but I just really want to highlight that particular aspect. Um, so there's a lot of parameters. I list them here. Check out the past talk to go through details on each one. So connection types. So I showed you cluster before. So that's one type of connection. So that'll be an HDR set. Grid if you're dealing with ER grid, REPL set if you're dealing with standard enterprise replication, and server set if you just want to have a single server. So there's some different ways to configure it. All depends on how you're trying to connect, or I should say how you're trying to set up users to connect. So standard cluster example, we're dealing with a primary and secondary. We're telling it servers to connect to, and that the priority is which server from connection manager do we consider the lead one, the primary one. So if we've got 4 connection manager servers, they'll be priority 1, 2, 3, 4. Lowest number comes first. So they break it down here. You can go back and look at the PDF. Um, so these are each of the options. I left them in here if you want to go scan later. So rather than bogging down, I'm going to kind of go through the newer information. One thing, and I'm going to highlight it here, I'm going to highlight it again later. One of the options for the listener is the mode option. There are 2 ways to do that. One of which is called redirect. you need to have at least the CSDK 3 or the JDBC 3.5. So if you've got some legacy product that's still using, ODB, the CSDK 2.7, or you're running some third-party, driver, you're not going to be able to work with redirect. It will just fail. Um, how this works is it actually takes the client and actually hands it off directly to the server. But the client driver needs to know how to handle the handoff. Proxy, on the other hand, will actually treat the connection manager as the middleman. So all the connections will actually, all the data will actually get transferred through it. With some of our configurations in a minute, that'll become important. So redirect. So it's clear how this works. So we've got our clients, we've got our HDR set up here, and what'll happen? Our clients come in and connect. The connection will go and sees that, okay, group 1 is where this rule is taking us. And from group 1, okay, we're telling it we want to go to the secondary. This could be we've told it this particular connection to always go to the secondary. It might be the least used. There's different reasons why. There is logic that you can put in place on how that listener works and what the connection manager will handle. And then what happens is connection manager gets out of the way. It comes in, goes, all right, the secondary is where we're going to work with. It hands that secondary off to the client, and then the client directly connects to the secondary. So at this point, the connection needs to be directly between the two, and the connection manager is no longer in play unless the client comes and does a reconnect. The second way, so it then connects to both clients. The second way is with a proxy. So same thing where the clients come in and connect. Connection goes, looks at the server. Yeah, let's say this time on this rule, we want the primary. What happens at this point is the connections now, when somebody does a request from those clients, the request still goes to the connection manager, and the connection manager issues that SQL statement to that primary server. And then when the primary server runs the query, returns back the data goes back to the connection manager and then goes back to the client from there. So all the transactions are between the client and the connection manager, and then from the connection manager to the server. There's some real advantages to this with some of the different setups. It also will support all of our old legacy or third-party drivers. So we don't need to worry about those being completely, lost if we want to use the connection manager. So, and again, then it's, just everything back and forth between the connection manager. Obviously, load-wise, you need to keep this in mind, depending on how much data is being transferred, how much, how many requests. We might need to increase the resources on the connection manager server, or have more connection manager servers spread across more middleman servers to just spread the load. So these are just some of the other settings, the use aliases, the policy. So these are different things to actually tune that listener to tell it what the rules are that the connection manager should follow. So sample configuration. I really want to highlight this one, that there are a number of names when you're setting up your connection manager. And especially if it is your first time setting it up, I really recommend you refer back to this particular slide. I have gotten myself confused many times setting these up, so it is very common that happens. But in this case, we're dealing with 5 different names that we need to keep in mind. The first one is the actual name of the connection manager. So this is the particular connection manager instance. This is what that is called. The second one down is the SSL label. So when we're setting up encryption, which we'll be doing here in a moment, this is actually the internal label for when clients connect to the connection manager. This does not necessarily need to be unique between connection manager servers, but you do not want this being using the same value as any of your Informix servers. The next one is our internal name. So this is a particular cluster or name shared between all of the connection manager instances. So as long as all of the instances have the same name for the cluster or the grid or the REPL set, which is ER, it'll know that, okay, these are exactly the same. These are all handled the same. So if we have a connection manager swap, so another connection manager becomes the primary, everybody is still on the same page. The Informix servers are still on the same page for what is registered to them. So you want to make sure that that is consistent. Um, the only part of it that should not be consistent is the priority, because again, the priority is if we're handling failovers, who is the authoritative resource. So again, third option or the third entry here, the cluster name. So that is the internal name. That is the only place it's needed. The next one is the Informix server, where we call it cluster one. This is important. So this is actually where this particular group of connections, where it is actually connecting to. If you're dealing with a single instance of Informix, it's in a big deal. It's whatever your primary is. But if you're dealing with multiple servers, multiple instances, you want to tell it which group of connections we want to go to here, especially if you're running 3 different instances, each one being an HDR set. So you have multiple instances, multiple server names that are primaries. We want to make sure it's pointing to the correct one. So that's where Informix server is important. And the last one is the SLA name. So in this case, it's report one. This is actually the listener entry in SQLHOSTS. So when you're setting it up, this will actually attach back to a new line in your SQL host. It's going to be called report one. So in SQL host, you'll give it the port number it's running on, any other settings with it. So that is the other name to be aware of. So again, there's 5 names here. The only ones that are being SQL hosts are cluster one and report one, but they are all important. So again, example SQL hosts. The first part is a group of replicated servers up there. That's cluster one that we mentioned on the last slide. And then the second one is a group of connection manager listeners. So we see here report one, and we're telling it that that's going to start on port 10,088. So when I'm a client, I'm going to be connecting to report one on port 10,088 and let the connection manager handle pointing me to the correct REPL 1 or 2 server or whatever the rules may be. So again, the application, all we need is the connection manager listeners. We do not need the direct server listeners for it to be able to connect. So when you start up connection manager, there's a handy log. You can define how much information is in there, but it'll show you the listeners coming up, start showing you the connections, and then it starts going and actually querying the servers that you've identified and actually figuring out from the servers themselves who's primary, who's secondary, what are the RSS servers, what are our aliases. It goes through, queries the servers, and gets all that information directly from them. So again, there's just more of an example of what it looks like, but you'll actually see it connecting to the servers and let you know if any of them are not able to connect. So once you've actually got it up and running, it'll also log anytime somebody connects. So you can actually, as long as you have logging turned on, so you can actually see where somebody is coming in, what the SLA is, which is the listener name. So the first 2 are coming into the listener report RR, and then the third entry is somebody coming into the listener of primary CM. And then you actually see the IP they're coming from, and then it will show you where it's redirecting to. So again, it's following whatever rules you have in place and then sending them over to the server needed. There's also a handy onstat command, onstatg cmsm, that'll actually show you all of the listeners that you have, the number of connections that have come through them, the ports they're on, and then what the rules are at. So you can actually go through your system, see what's actively being used, and if there's anything you need to tune, or just, keep an eye on things and make sure everything is registered correctly. So now we're gonna that is most of the stuff from the past talk. So hopefully you all have dealt with it before. At this point of the talk, if you're following along and setting up your connection manager at home, at this point you should be able to follow along with that information and have a connection have a connection manager set up that talks to your servers. You can get connections pointed across. You have a basic setup. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually use this in a real environment. How do we make more use of it than the simple? The big one that I don't see used enough is proxy. Again, proxy is really useful if you've got legacy code. I deal with quite a few customers that they've got that old application written in, Visual Basic 6, or, they've got some web app that was written in, 2003 that nobody, it works really, really well, so they don't want to change anything. They've got these really cool applications, but they're set up using third-party drivers to do it. So we can't use redirect for that. However, we can still use proxy. We can still go in and have the advantages of Connection Manager, have the benefits, have all the power of it, have all the sanity saving single point of connection that you don't have if you are connecting just to a single server. Um, so one of the other ways that you can set this up and that is not used enough is actually using a DMZ. If you have not worked with networking and you haven't worked with a DMZ before, what the concept is you have the public internet, the public networks, and you normally have your private networks, is your, everything behind your firewall, your internal servers, etc. Um, a lot of places they just poke a hole through the firewall and say, okay, if you're coming in from public, you can reach this web server on port 80 or port 443 or whatever it is. You're coming in, you can poke and hit Informix on port 9088 on this server, etc. What that does, however, is it means that you have to have that port open on the firewall. And as creative as hackers have gotten these days, and vulnerabilities with firewalls and whatever else is out there, fewer points of entry the better. The less that your network, your gear is available to the internet or even to wider networks, the better. So what a DMZ is a dedicated network that lives between public and private. So this would be somewhere that you can host servers, you can host infrastructure, but that if something were to happen, it wouldn't to those servers, it would not then expose the rest of your network. It's not a gateway point where if someone were to breach a server that then, they would have unfettered access to the rest of everything else in your private network. So where proxy comes into play here is you can set up a connection manager server in a DMZ and use proxy to pass it back to the actual Informix server. So at no point do you actually need to expose direct network connections to that Informix server from your public network. Your public network, which also can be an isolated part of your internal network. It doesn't have to be on the internet directly. But your clients come in and all they can do is talk to the server sitting in the DMZ, which is our connection manager. So users connect there. The connection manager in the DMZ plays middleman, passing the data back and forth to your private network through for your Informix data. And so customers can never get directly to that Informix server. There's auditing reasons for this. There are good security practice reasons for this, but it gives you an option to have your network set up in a more secure way. Let your networking team do what it is that they do, and hopefully, they'll be happy if you're coming to them going, "Hey, I've got this solution that'll make us more secure. That'll, tick that box that you need ticked." So it's a really useful piece for that. And again, proxy is fully supported by legacy code, so really should not need to change anything as far as that goes. Um, and also, just with any other pieces, you can have multiple connection managers sitting your DMZ, working as proxy, um, passing data back and forth. You just need to have your network team allow whatever the proxy servers are to be able to talk Informix back to the Informix server. So as a note, also with proxy, this will not support redirect connections. Um, So if you try using a redirect for a server that's in DMZ, your connections are most likely going to fail. So just be aware that, once you put something in the DMZ, you really need to rely on proxy for it and just plan accordingly for resources needed. And again, as the last note here is you can really harden the connection manager box. The only access that is really needed to that system, I mean, you might need shell access to get in as Informix, but it's not access that's needed by the wider world. Maybe something where you have a limited connection pool, any number of ways that your security teams can set it up. But all you really need is the listener port on the for connection manager, and then the ability to talk to the Informix box. Past that, so one bidirectional out and one bidirectional in. So the next one, I'm going to spend a while on this, is actually encrypting connection manager. I've given whole talks on actually going through and encrypting network traffic for Informix. As a friendly reminder, and if you have not seen those to scare you, if you do not use encryption, your data is passed in clear text. That includes your passwords. So if you're doing your connections, you're doing your Informix work, it means that anything between your client and your server is going over clear text if you do not encrypt it. Encryption also, if you've had a number of people tell me this, if you tried encrypting your data 10 years ago and it was slow, try it again. They have done a lot of work to increase the performance on encryption. Plus, CPUs are much faster than they used to be. Benchmarked it on an old box and on an old version of Informix, it was 40% overhead. Benchmarked it again, same data set, newer box, Informix 12 at that point, it was a 4.5% overhead. So performance should not be the limiting factor for why you put encryption in. In our case, it is a little complex to get it working with Connection Manager, so I wanted to detail a how-to here. It doesn't really matter if you're doing redirected or proxy. I mean, you can include your encrypted connections with proxy in DMZ, however you want to do it. You can have it be the client and directly connection manager is encrypted. You can set it up for redirect encryption. It all depends on how you want to configure it. But I really recommend, regardless of what you're doing, start using encrypted connections. So as far as the connection manager goes, what we really care about encrypting as far as the client is my connection from me to the connection manager. That's the part we need to make sure that we have a valid encryption tunnel. On the other side, then, we need to have encryption playing nicely between connection manager and the server. The nice thing with that process is the connection manager to the server is the same process, the same configuration as you do when connecting a client directly to the server. So that process is the same. The other point, just on technical here, with how encryption works with Informix, the only time the keys you create are used for it is when you actually initiate the connection. It goes through, initiates the connection, and then creates a unique key just for that particular session, and then that key goes away. So you don't have to worry about if something is shared here that it is a huge security vulnerability. You'll see with some of the examples when we're talking about it, sharing the same certificate or the same client keys between different connection managers, you're still going to get a unique encryption key every time somebody connects. So a lot of work was done there to make sure everyone is kept safe. So I'm going to go through the commands here briefly. I am doing this with the GS kit because it is more readily available for older, or I shouldn't say for older versions, but anything other than the last couple of years will only have GS kit. They are now including the ability to use OpenSSL for your certificates, so that is available. I just put the more standard one here. It's the same concept for both. Um, Most of our work we're going to do in Informixter/SSL. That may be created already. It may not be. Just depends. I'm going to be calling the Informix server Informix1 just to make my life easy. And so the first thing we're going to do is actually create our server keys. So this is our actual server key pair for our primary Informix server. So that first big long line there, the GSK8 CAPI 64. So that's actually the primary GSKit command. And so we're going to use that for all of our work with dealing with the key stores. So the first thing we do is actually create a new key database. We're going to call it informix1.kdb. We're going to give it a password of pass_word. Please use something stronger in the real world, and also make sure not to lose it. Best recommendation I have is write it down somewhere, put it in a sealed envelope, and put it in a safe somewhere, just in case you get hit by a truck and somebody needs to, or better yet, you get promoted and get an awesome raise, and you're now working across the world at an even better office. So you can have somebody that can go in and get the password in case it gets lost. The last flag there is --. We're going to use this fairly frequently. What that actually means is that there's going to be a file, a .sth file, that actually keeps the passwords in it. So that way applications can actually pull the passwords without having to prompt you. If that is not a acceptable security requirement, you can have it without the stash file, in which case you are going to have to enter that password anytime you are doing anything with the keys, such as starting or stopping the server. Um, so the second thing we're doing there, the second command, is we're going to create a certificate. So cert create, telling it the database file, we're using stashed, and then we give it the label. Labels are important. It tells the client when we are trying to connect to a particular server, which label the label will tell us which certificate to use. The other flag there is the expire 365. So as you can guess, this expires in 365 days. Some places there is a requirement for the number of days you have. Some places there is not. I want to flag here that means every year you're going to need to do brand new keys for your Informix instances, get those keys out to clients, make sure that the key rings, everything is fully up to date, and that's going to be an annual process. Depending on your environment and what your security policies are, whether that is what you want or not, you can set it to 10 years if you want to. Just make sure that somebody is noting on policy calendars a bit of time before that is going to expire, because once that expires, all of your connections are going to break until a new key is deployed. So don't leave that one to the last second. Then the last thing we have is our DN, which is LDAP style naming. So this is just a unique name that's attached to the certificates. The second thing we do, or the next thing we do, is we need to add a SOC SSL listener to our DB server aliases and as a new listener for SQL hosts. Just like our old OnSOC TCP, we just call it OnSOC SSL, and just have a matching name in our DB server aliases. It's just like spinning up a new listener any other way. The other piece we need here is the SSL Keystore label. So this is a field that'll actually tell the things connecting what the server label is. So make sure that matches up with the label you've got above. So we've got our Keystore created at this point, so it's our little key database. Now we need to do something with it. Actually, I should say at this point, we could actually bring our engine down and then back up, and now have our SSL listener in place. But we couldn't use it for anything. We try to connect, it's going to fail, etc. Side note is, with Informix currently, you cannot use the onmode commands to dynamically bring up SSL listeners. You do have to bring the engine down and back up. So anyway, so we've got our key database. We need to get something out of it so we can connect. So what we're going to do is extract the certificate. And we're going to pass in, tell it which label, so our Informix1 certificate, and give it a target. So this is going to write out a flat file on disk called informix1.cert, which this is our certificate information. We can then use that to actually import it into our client Keystore. So client Keystore, just like we did with the server Keystore, we're going to call it. This can be whatever name you want. Same thing, we are going to give it a password at this point and tell it to stash. So we're now going to add our certificates. So we've gone through, we've got 3 servers, we've exported the server certificates for them. Now we're going to take those certificates and actually import them into the Keystore. So you see it's cert add database and then the file we're importing from. So at this point, we've run this 3 times. We've now got certificates for Informix 1, 2, and 3. So at this point, our client now knows the Keystore that we're actually going to, or the key certificate information we're going to need all in the Keystore. Last piece we need to do is there's a file that needs to be created, which is informixter/etc/conssl.cfg. It has 2 lines, our SSL keystore file and our SSL keystore STH or stash file. They point to whatever you called your client data store. Do note this, you do need permissions on this file, and your client keystore and stash file need to be readable by whatever user you're using to connect. So if you've got application users, make sure that they can read that file as well. There's nothing sensitive in that in the client Keystore. All it knows is part of the key, the part it needs to connect into the server, but there's not the sensitive part that's only in the server Keystore. So we set up con SSL, and what that is used for is by applications like, poorly known application that no one ever possibly uses in the Informix world called DB Access. When you use DB Access and connect to an SSL connection, it'll go through, pull the con SSL.cfg file from informixter/etc and look for the Keystore file and stash file, and then use those when it actually is initiating the connection. So that file is really important. So we've gone through, we've set up our server and our client now, which we've talked about before. I wanted to bring it up again to remind everybody these are the steps we take. So the next thing we're going to do is actually go in and set this up with Connection Manager. Obviously we want our listeners, including our SSL listeners, in our SQL host file that Connection Manager is going to use. So a couple of pieces that are easy to trip on. The first one is note our listeners that we're going to be using. The second one is our Connection Manager name. So remember I said before, going way back, our name in the Connection Manager config file. So in our case, we're going cm1. So our key store for that is actually going to be cm1.kdb, and it needs to be an informixter/SSL. It does this automatically, but you need to manually have created the key store for Connection Manager to know what it's going to be using. The second piece you need to know is remember from my little diagram with the list of the 5 names. The second one was the SSL label. So this is actually going to be the certificate that we use when clients are connecting to Connection Manager. So this is the certificate that uses. In our case, we're going to use Informix/cm/SSL. This can be whatever it is you want it to be. We're just using that as a sample. So we're going to now create a third key store. So this is going to be our Connection Manager key store. So, if you look at the first GSK command, we're going to create database cm1.kdb. We're going to give it a password. We're going to say it expires after a year. We're going to stash it. However you need to configure it. Then the second part is we need to actually create an internal certificate for the SSL label. So you can create it, password. So it's the same way we did before. The CN, I threw in there just the backtick host name. So that way, if you're scripting this between multiple connection managers, you'd get kind of unique certificates for each connection manager. You do not need to do that at all. It was just a helpful thing. And then notice the label here, the Informix CM SSL. So this matches the SSL label field from our Connection Manager listener. So if you do not make sure all of these are the same, you're going to get a number of fairly cryptic GSKit errors when you're trying to get going. So next thing we need to do is we need to have Connection Manager for its Keystore know how to connect to the Informix servers over SSL. So just like we did those imports for the certificate files for servers 1, 2, and 3 to the client Keystore, we're going to do the same with our Connection Manager Keystore. So example as before, we're going to add it to the CM1 KDB, give it the KDB's password file, tell it the certificate file to use, and it's going to trust it. This way now our connection manager key stores has all the certificates and knows how to connect on all of that. Make sure, and big thing here, if you're running multiple connection managers, make sure to use the same key store. Whether you do them by hand to do them the same, or you take the same KDB and stash file and just copy those around, make sure it's consistent. The last thing you want is to miss a server on one of your connection manager servers, and then you've got the problem where when people connect, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It depends what connection manager they're going through. Those are a headache to debug. Make sure you're consistent. Make sure they are all the same. So we're now going to configure our client. So this is my application, whether it's an ODBC application, DB Access, I've got a JDBC application, whatever it may be. I need to have a certificate for it to work with. And what I'm going to do is pull the SSL labeled certificate out of the connection manager database. So we're going to extract and we're going to give it the label that we have for our SSL label value and then put it into a cert file. We now take that and import it into our client keyring, and our client now should be able to connect. So I'm gonna just go through the rest of my slides here real quick and then do a fast demo. So this is kind of the new stuff. So this is one of the biggest things was SSL, but it's also looking at how do we deal with a DMZ setup, or even you don't need this and you just want a simple, the beginning part that will do it. I really stress Connection Manager will make your life easier. The number of places I know of that they have a single point of failure with a connection at some point, and when that single point is down, you have OS patching, something's changed on networking, what have you, and now everybody is dead in the water, and you either have to wait for that one particular piece to come back online, or you're running around having to modify client connection strings on production systems. It's a lot of headache and it's a lot of potential for problems. When you're dealing with Connection Manager, it is meant to handle that. It is meant to route connections to the right places. It is meant to be reliable, robust, and remove a single point of failure for connections. So really recommend you use it. There's no additional cost. The only piece there is additional time. And especially if you're using redirect, there's not even a lot of overhead as far as processing goes. So it's not a bad thing to even have it spun up on a small, VMware instance, have a few of those running with different connection managers and configure your clients to connect in as needed to whichever one is appropriate, or even better yet, to have several in a list. So if one's down, it'll go to the next. Just if you can remove single point of failures anywhere from your applications to your databases, you're doing good. So a couple of best practices with Connection Manager in general. Generally recommended to use with your SQL host, use groups when you're dealing with more than one server rather than pointing to a single server. Just that way it can go through the list of the group entries to find the right one. Make sure that it is not required, but it is a good practice to have your connection manager separate from your Informix instances. Just that way you don't have a single box that if it goes down, it takes out the connections. Depending on your environment, it may not matter. If you're running proxy and it's a real heavy duty application, make sure your network and the CPU and the connection manager system, are ready to handle that much load. with your applications, set them up with a group, depending on the language that you're using. There are different ways to do this, but so that there's more than one connection manager it knows about. So if one connection manager is down, it'll go to the second one. The other big one is making sure your applications or your clients connect with the delay, or reconnect with the delay, I should say. Where if you've got it where connect failure, connect failure, connect failure, connect failure, dead, means that if you're dealing with a failover, it's going to die before it has a chance for Informix to fail over. Informix failovers take about a minute to 2 minutes if it's happening automatically. So if if your application has tried and died in 10 seconds, it's probably not going to do you a lot of good. Doing a 30-second retry with 10 retries is not a bad practice. Depends on your environment. Things to be cautious about if you're using automatic failover from Connection Manager, split brain is a possibility. I'm going to slide on that in a second. If listeners are missing your information, remember again, go back to the slide. I can't bring it up enough where it lists out the different names. If you've got one of those configured incorrectly compared to your SQL hosts, it's not going to work, and it's either going to fail coming up or you'll just have errors connecting. Alias issues, this is one to be aware of. If you've got multiple DB server aliases for a system, um, you can, it'll actually, when the connection manager is initially probing, it'll pull those connections in. So if some of those listeners are tied to things like other networks, let's say you have a separate listener that's on just a crossover cable to your second box, but nobody else can reach it. If you don't have use aliases off, um, one of the settings earlier, it may try to route people to that separate network, which won't work, and you'll get failure. So just make sure that when you're planning out your listeners, that you plan out where they should actually connect to. Um, Missing trusted status, you need to either have our hosts or set up shared passwords. Make sure that servers can talk to each other and trust each other. With the key rings is make sure they've got your labels correct in there. If you've got your names mixed up, you forget an underscore, you forget a TCP, whatever it may be with your labels, your key ring will not be able to, or Keystore will not be able to tell it which is the correct certificate, and it will fail. Split brain, just real quick on that. If you're using HDR and one of your servers you do a failover, your old primary server comes back up, it'll see there's a new primary server and not actually come all the way up and go back down. Um, that way, it'll keep a consistent log chain. However, if your primary and secondary cannot talk to each other, then the network connection is down, something else. So the failovers happen. The old primaries gets brought up online. They're both now primary servers. They're on different log chains the moment it comes online, and you will not be able to reconcile it. You're going to have to pick which one you want to go with and then do a new backup and a new restore. Just be careful with the auto failover with Connection Manager. If that's sitting somewhere between the two servers and issues a failover because network's down, you can have this occur. Um, not a lot of customers that I've worked with actually use auto failover, but it is there available. And this is the main reason why you want to, having somebody, with an own, mushy, fleshy brain, deciding when to fail over is usually a good policy. So again, this is just the auto failover and what can happen with split brain. If your listeners are missing information, you'll get a 930 error. This could be from SQL hosts on either side. Just triple check yourself on your SQL host, on your client, on your server, and on your connection manager. Also, make sure to remember each connection manager listener needs a unique port, both unique from each other and unique from anything else running on that server, including Informix. Um, so, uh, note that you need to make sure things are trusted, just as a reminder there. So I'm going to do a quick demo and then we will get to questions, unless there's any questions that are urgent. Okay, I'm not seeing any right now. So I'm going to pull this up, and I am hoping that with this being a live demo, everything works exactly correct, which we all hope. So what I've got in here is on my left side, this is a client computer. So this knows about Connection Manager. On the right-hand side here, I've actually got the Connection Manager log. So you can see where everything came up cleanly before at the top. Trying to hide, sorry, hiding the chat. Where everything came up cleanly, it's gone in, it's connected to our servers, shows the arbitrator, which is our primary one, is active. So if we're dealing with auto failover, it knows where it is. And then you actually see where the SLA here, so the listener 1, listener 2, listener 3, listener 4 are all online. Tells it where it's connecting from and where it'll go to. Sorry, those are actual connections. Above up here is when they came online. So what I'm going to do is just show an example of where Connection Manager is going to come in useful. Actually, so DB access, our old friend, and we're going to connect. And there are 4 connections here that are for Connection Manager. HDR SSL, which this is a straight redirect secured connection. Gets cut off here, but there's HDR SSL proxy, which is our proxy SSL connection. Our HDR TCP, which will be going to our replicate pair primary server, and our Informix RSS TCP, which will go to whatever the primary or fastest RSS server. In our environment here, we're dealing with 3 servers: our primary, our secondary, and our RSS. So for most of these, they should be pointing us to the primary, because we want to treat it like this is an application that may read or write. So we want it to go into the primary server, because that is where we are doing our write, going to be able to do our writes. If it directs us to the secondary, that's not going to do us a lot of good. So going to do the first one. This is the very straightforward TCP connection. Just going to connect straight through. And you notice over here, it just popped up. We're going to, redirect SQLi client, and we're pointing it over to our Informix 3 TCP, which is our current primary listener, and then gives it the IP address and the port number it is coming from, or sorry, getting pointed to. And, our usual, we've got our stores demo. And what I've actually got here is a quick bit of code that will actually tell us where we are connected. So this is sort of the nothing up my sleeves. And we are connected now to Informix 3 TCP. It's telling it the server name is Informix 14C. So we've now connected through Connection Manager. This is a redirect. I'm now talking directly to Informix 3 TCP. Connection Manager is out of the picture. I will not touch Connection Manager again until I've disconnected and reconnected, which is actually what I'm going to do right now. So the next thing we're going to connect is our SSL listener. And so you can actually see here where it's connecting to our Informix HDR SSL connection. It's going to our SSL listener. And when we run the command now, it's actually still showing it's the TCP, I think, because it is pulling the DB server name. It's pulling whatever the primary is. Next one. I should apologize. I missed that mistake in the SQL. So this is our proxy. So you actually see where it's showing now a trusted connection request. Something with my network is pulling it up as IPv6. So, and then the last connection is going to be our RSS. So you'll actually see this here. We're redirect, and we're actually pointing it to our RSS server, and if I'm telling you incorrectly, I apologize. And it is not pulling to the RSS server, and I apologize for that. It should be. It's going to the right listener. This is what happens with a live demo when I had my entire demo infrastructure crash last night. So, at any rate, that should be working. I must have a typo somewhere in my connection manager config, which I will actually demonstrate now. So it's pretty straightforward here. I call it CM1. So again, I'm using it's CM1.KDB for that. We're giving it our SSL labels. So when we're actually working with certificate for the clients, it's going to be Informix underscore CM underscore SSL. You can name it whatever you want. We've got our cluster name here. So this is name number 3. So this is just for our connection managers. Number 4 is our Informix server, INF SSL. So in this case, it is a group of SSL listeners. Informix does some really cool stuff where under the covers with Connection Manager, when it first connects to a server, it'll go in and query that server for all of its pieces. So even though I'm telling it to connect initially to the SSL listener, it'll actually go in and pull both the SSL and non-SSL listeners and serve them up accordingly. Oh, that's why the RSS wasn't working. I accidentally had DB server set to primary rather than RSS. Changing it now, so when I will put these sample files in the package. So this will then, once I do that, once I refresh Connection Manager, it'll now redirect specifically to RSS. So you can see we're on the SSL proxy. We are working with the mode proxy, and it's got, actually I'll show SQLHOSTS here in a moment. Failover information, alarm program information, if we want to work with that. Then the last piece is, and again, I will include this with the final package here, is our connections. All this bottom part is the part we care about. So these are the connection manager listeners. We've got our standard TCP, our SSL proxy, and our RSS. So notice both of our SSLs are on SOC SSL. I'm having them bind to all IPs on the system. You obviously can hard code that if you want. And then over here, I've got the port number it's working with. Let me fix the spacing on this, just so it lines up a little better. So you can see where each listener has its own unique port for the connection manager SLAs. And then down here, we have our actual standard Informix information. So we've got our port, our IP address, and it's the 3 different servers they're put into single groups. You'll notice the SSL ones are on SOC SSL. The only place this is needed, where we need both the connection manager listener and the Informix server listener information, is for the connection manager server itself. For an actual client system, all you need is this top part. All you need is to tell it where is the connection manager listening, what is the protocol it's listening on, and what is the port number it's using, and the name. Those little 4 lines are all you need for the client. The connection manager will handle telling it all of the bottom part. If it's using redirect or proxy, it doesn't need that at all. So it simplifies a little bit what your SQL host may be like for passing out to clients. Again, it takes a little bit to set up, and then it makes your life easier, which, kind of the point of a lot of these features is to make everybody's life easier, make Informix more robust, and again, there's no cost software-wise on this. So I'm going to jump back into any questions and see if I can get lost the chat box at some point.
Here, everybody's on mute, so if you find the chat box, and I'll read them to you if I see any, and you don't have chat, Tom, find the chat box and put your question there. Also, there is a raise hand icon at the bottom of the screen. If you have a question, you can raise your hand. And if I scroll through the list of participants, I may see you with a raised hand.
All right. While people are chatting, a couple other quick things. We've got an upcoming WAG meeting, Washington Area Informix User Group. We'll actually be announcing all the topics in the next few days. I know we'll have Paul Watson from Onanit and Mike Walker from XDB Systems presenting. We are working out the rest of the schedule. It'll be the morning of June 23rd. This is free. It'll be virtual. We're doing this in tandem with the IIUG, so we greatly appreciate the support there. So we've got some basic information up on the website. We will have more up shortly. So that's coming up. Highly recommended. It'll be a very, worthwhile presentation and fixing that HTTPS because it is not 1999 anymore. So XDB Systems, who I'm with, we do consulting and support. A lot of different options. Our remote DBA offerings are great for peace of mind or just backup for your expert self, so you can actually go on vacation. We do consulting. We do a lot with upgrades and migrations. So we are available if you have any questions or need anything. And thank you for being on. Thank you for putting up with my slightly gravelly voice right now. Really appreciate it. Really do appreciate the IUG, the amount of time you all spend on putting these sessions together, getting them out, making this information available to the community, making the education available. It's such a valuable thing and really do appreciate it. So really wanted to stress that. Lastly, we've got the IG has the Tech Talks channel on YouTube. This will probably be up there if you're listening to it not live. That's where you'll be finding it. So it is available. Highly recommend if you've not been through it, go back through some of the past ones. Subscribe to it and see all the ones that are coming up. All right, got a question here. All right, so first one is the advice on setting up multiple connection managers. The couple of big pieces, one of which is do not set them up on the same server. Have them on separate servers, hopefully separate hardware. It's trying to reduce the number of potential single point of failures. They run fine on virtual images, but if you're running 4 of them on the same VMware ESXi box and that box needs to come down for a patch, you've now lost your multiple point of failure or gone to a single point of failure that just went down. So really recommend spreading them out. And it's fine to have them next to an Informix server. Just be aware that you want to have more than one of those available. Second thing is be sane with your naming. It is fine to say connection manager 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You'd say connection manager East Coast, West Coast. You can have different connection managers pointing to the same servers that have different rules. Again, for East Coast, West Coast example, you might have different servers you want to prioritize depending on where somebody is coming in from. Most of the time, things are centralized enough that you'd want them to be consistent. So the naming matters for that. The other big one is the priority, where you want to make sure with your SLAs that your priorities are really unique. And figure out what the order should be between 1 and I think it may be 254, I think is the highest, with low being what is the highest priority. So just make sure that for each one you have a different priority number. There's some nice things you can work in there with macros to make the configurations easier to manage. So I'm hoping that answers the question on multiple connection managers. So in the example, if the connection manager server goes down, you'll be able to connect to the database. In this case, for this example, yes, because I'm running a single connection manager. So, or I shouldn't say they won't be able to connect to the database. They wouldn't be able to connect through the connection manager to the database. The databases will still be up. They'll still be available. You could set up a group where there's one connection manager listener and a secondary listener directly to the database. That certainly is fine to do, but in my example, yeah, I was only running a single connection manager. So anytime you're running a single anything, it becomes a single point of failure. Again, with my example, it is the it'll be something where hopefully you're running a couple of connection managers. You've got your application set up for your primary and secondary connection managers, which are tied to your primary and secondary Informix instances. So if any one of those 4 places goes down, you're still up and running. If even 2 of those go down, you're still up and running. So it's depends on your environment how to best work it. But again, the fewer points of failure you can get, the better. Other questions? All right, I greatly appreciate it. Lester, any wrap up notes?
No, thank you very much. This has been an awesome talk, Tom. Since it's live, it'll probably take a day or two before this is on our YouTube website. So check back in a day or two, and you'll see it there. That's all. Tom, you want to end it?
I will end it. Thank you all so much.